started and jump right into Napoleon Bonaparte, the first story, his early life and his later years, and everything else in between. So starting with the early years of Napoleon, who was born on the island of Corsica, which remember was really never part of the mainland of France, but was a French territory being controlled by the French. And that's where Napoleon grew up, and despite him not being part of the mainland, he still had a huge patriotism for his country, and he wanted to serve, which is why at 16 in 1785, he went to Paris and he joined the military academy. Now, despite his young age, Napoleon really was able to rise to the ranks of the military fairly quickly, and there really are two main reasons for this. The first of all being that, of course, Napoleon was a natural at military affairs and was a genius leader in combat, but secondly was because he was able to align himself with a group called the Jacobins, who at the time were a far-left political movement that really became a radical but powerful revolutionary group later on in the French Revolution, starting in 1789. And also for a little bit of background when he was growing up was that in 1789, when the French Revolution started, France started to become from a republic to a dictatorship led by the Committee of Public Safety, who was also led by Robespierre. And basically this group and Robespierre helped incite this period of mass suspicion and paranoia of counter-revolutionaries in France, commonly known as a period of the Great Terror. And as a result of this, even the French people who were cutting people's heads off before were like, hey, this is going a bit too far even for us. So essentially what happens is that the Jacobins fall from power, Robespierre is executed, and in 1795, the Directory, which essentially is a new form of government for the French, took control of the country. Now, though it may seem that Napoleon right now is in a good situation because his main group he was supporting basically got kicked out of power, it really started to turn out well for Napoleon. The first of all reason was because Napoleon's not stupid. Of course, when the Jacobins started to fall, he also saw that and said, well, now I want to go to the other side. And that's exactly what he does. Actually, he forms an alliance with a few members of the Directory and eventually becomes the director of the Army of Interior, which basically meant that if the Directory wanted to make any decisions on military matters or strategy, they would consult Napoleon, which in a sense actually made Napoleon the leader of the entire army, which at the time in France was extremely large, mainly because they'd been fighting wars with Prussia and Austria and their neighbors to fend off counter-revolutionary forces. But a second reason of why Napoleon would be especially good for leading the country at the time would be because after the French Revolution, people were tired. They were sick of people being killed in the streets and after all the accusations and false accusations of people being counter-revolutionaries, and they really just wanted a stable person to really lead them all. And to them, Napoleon eventually became that figure. So actually what ended up happening is that the Directory started becoming very unpopular for several reasons. Its system of having a 5-member committee really wasn't working, and overall, not much progress was being made as originally was hoped in French people, because they of course wanted progress. So Napoleon realizes this and creates a plan. A plan for what, you may ask? To overthrow the government, of course. And that is exactly what he does. In 1799, he forms a coup and overthrows the Directory, actually with relative ease, because for one, he had the support of the French people, who remembered really just wanted an authoritative figure that didn't mess up for once. So now that Napoleon's taken over the Directory, what he decides to do is set up a new form of French government called the French Consulate, with himself named as leader. But even under this system, Napoleon still had to submit to many under his belt and make compromises to get things done, which, if you know Napoleon. So where do you really go from there if you're already leader of the new government you set up? Well, why not become emperor? And that's exactly what Napoleon does. He names himself emperor in 1804. But Napoleon doesn't just name himself emperor, he actually crowns himself too, which during the time was a huge deal because typically it was the Pope during the coronation ceremony which would basically crown someone that powerful as Napoleon was. But look at this primary source. If you look to the right of Napoleon, what do you see? You actually see the Pope Pius VII standing right next to him. So why would Napoleon have someone who would typically crown the emperor be invited without actually having him do the coronation? Well, Napoleon wanted to make it a symbolic gesture, saying that he would be subservient to no one on earth and that Rome would never command him. But this also led to a big connection that what Napoleon would do later on with the church, which, if you remember, during the French Revolution was undergoing a process of de-Christianization, which, if you remember, was a time in the French Revolution where liberal radicals argued for a complete shutdown and control of the church by the state. And during that time, with the French people being the majority Catholic, that was holding them together as a religion, when that religion is basically broken down and no longer subservient to them, then there's nothing unifying the French people. And Napoleon, as a leader, doesn't want a disunified France. He wants a unified France, of course. So what he decides to do is actually start to make reforms within and of the Catholic Church, and his biggest thing being the Concordance of 1801, which really is the best example of this policy of really merging Catholicism not as the state religion, but as a religion of the majority of the French. In fact, if we were to look directly at the primary source itself, we can say as follows. Before entering upon their functions, the bishops shall take directly at the hands of the first consul the oath of fidelity which was in use before the change of the government, expressed in the following terms. I swear and promise to God upon the Holy Scriptures to remain in obedience and fidelity to the government established by the Constitution of the French Republic. So while Napoleon today can really be judged as a dictator by our standards, before, even though he was a dictator, he was really well liked by his people. And one way he was able to achieve this was through his broad use of propaganda. In fact, historians often agree that Napoleon was the first modern political figure to use the rhetoric of revolution and nationalism to back up his military force. And like we see here with this painting of Napoleon leading his soldiers into battle in a style that is so neoclassical, so oozing with patriotism. And with these sort of elements combined into a state that really wants to have a weapon of imperial expansion as their main source of nationalism per se, that really acts to serve his own increase in power. Now, of course, there are several other things Napoleon did during his reign, which you're probably going to need to know for the AP Euro exam, or maybe you can pull out in a document or writing. So for time's sake, I put them in a quick list for you to check out. So the last main thing you really need to know about Napoleon Bonaparte I was his wars, starting in 1798 and eventually his downfall of these wars in 1815 in the Battle of Waterloo. And so also keep in mind that the common theme throughout his wars was that often because France was so strong at the time, there was many coalitions set up against Napoleon. I think, in fact, there were 7 in total before he could actually be defeated. And these coalitions, of course, formed from big ones where almost entirety of Central Europe was up against France to just a few like Britain and Russia. Now, aside from Napoleon actually beating most of these coalitions, there were 2 big setbacks that led to the downfall of Napoleon I. One of them being Britain and the second being Russia. So first on France's conflict with Great Britain. You see, the Watt conflict in the first place was really just an interesting dynamic because Napoleon was well aware of Britain's naval power and Britain was well aware that they wanted to avoid war altogether. So because of this, in the beginning, the 2 countries decided to make the Peace of Amiens, a temporary truce between the 2 countries that really didn't last long because eventually France's territories got so large that Britain became nervous enough that they actually had to take action declaring war in 1805. So what went down after this was a naval skirmish at the Battle of Trafalgar, where the British, led by Admiral Nelson, won handedly. Now, Napoleon basically realizes that Britain wastes their resources at the current moment because they're so strong, and so he started to put France's focus more on the rest of Europe. But then a problem started to rise for Napoleon. He had already conquered the rest of Europe at a certain time. So where does he go from there? Of course, back to Britain. And now Napoleon realized from before that the French obviously couldn't beat the British in battle. So what Napoleon decided to do was to use the states under France's influence to his advantage and start to hit Britain economically rather than militarily. And this was through a series of blockades against Britain, forcing all other partners under France's influence to stop trade with the same country. This went exactly the opposite way Napoleon wanted it to. Britain simply found economic refuge in trade with the Americas. However, the continental system, on the same hand, only hurt France and the rest of Europe, because apparently not being able to trade with Europe's most valuable exporter doesn't help the economics of your home state. And as a result, many of the European states forced to follow the system became very angry at France and started to go against French rule and continue trade with Great Britain. And the most notable of these states that defied France's blockade against Britain and the continental system was Russia. And Napoleon was already very nervous about his clutch on reign during the time, and he wanted to send a message that you can't just defy the French Empire. So what happens? France declares war on Russia. This was the main downfall for Napoleon Bonaparte. And a big reason for this was because of the heavy amount of casualties Napoleon suffered in Russia, where eventually most of his army of 500,000 was destroyed with only 100,000 returning. And that was really bad for Napoleon because he still had another war to fight with Great Britain, and eventually he didn't have the troops. But why did Napoleon really lose so handedly to Russia, losing over 400,000 troops? And really occurred for 2 big reasons which you need to know. One of which was the harsh Russian winter that literally no other empire in history could conquer and beat Russia on, except for, of course, the Mongols. But equally as important as a reason was because of Russia's scorched earth policy, where as French troops would move into the mainland, Russian troops and civilians in towns about to be attacked would abandon and destroy their supplies, leaving nothing for the French to resupply themselves with as they moved closer and closer to Moscow. So now with France severely weakened from Russia, Napoleon was extremely vulnerable and actually was heavily defeated at 1814 in a battle where he had really no chance of winning because of the lack of troops. And after he was beaten, he was sent into exile on the island of Elba. So, of course, Napoleon has a big ego, and he doesn't want to just sit in exile for the rest of his life, so he doesn't really take it too seriously, and a year later, he really returns back to France and takes command again. He basically stops his own exile. And so, this is really the final end of Napoleon's days. He fights another 100 days, commonly known as a 100-day war in France, and eventually he was defeated by the Duke of Wellington in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. And after that battle, he was eventually exiled again, but this time to a place in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean where really he had no chance of escaping, and that's what ended up happening. Napoleon died years later in his exile. And in accordance to those who saw Napoleon in his final days of life, the Emperor Napoleon, who lately possessed such boundless power and disposed of so many crowns, now occupies a wretched hovel, a few feet square, which is perched upon a rock, unprovided with furniture and without either shutters or curtains to the windows. This place must serve him for a bedchamber, dressing room, dining room, study, and sitting room, and he is obliged to go out when it is necessary to have this one apartment cleaned. His meals, consisting of a few wretched dishes, are brought to him from a distance, as though he were a criminal in a dungeon. He is absolutely in want of the necessities of life. The bread and wine are not only not such as he has been accustomed to, but are so bad that we loathe to touch them. Water, coffee, butter, and oil, and the other articles are either not to be procured or are scarcely fit for use.